think I'll just sit here. I'm supposed to stand up. No, I'll stand up.
Yeah.
Right, so, what? I can see past this, so stand up. I'm not using any slides because, well, you know how it is with PowerPoint. First thing, PowerPoint doesn't work and blah, blah. It takes a lot of time. So, okay. These are just comments that are kind of coming together as some sort of a piece. It's not something I've done a lot of research on, but I'm interested in this question of the ruling class and whatever happened to them. To some extent, I'm heavily indebted to years of conversation with Doug Henwood about this, who has been threatening to write a book on the decline of the ruling class for years, but he's been busy with other stuff. So by the ruling class, I mean the politicized elements of the owning class. And what I'm going to argue is that the ruling class has gone from being a class for itself to being merely a class in itself. It's dominated by a short-term mentality of smash and grab, and this is the style of their rule is marked by short-termism. The ultimate measure of this is, of course, their failure to deal with climate change. I'm thinking here about particularly the American ruling class. You'd have to have a different analysis for other ruling classes. The Chinese ruling class seems pretty organized and pretty competent. The European ruling class, I don't know. But if you're wondering, well, how are we to measure their competence or incompetence? I mean, one measure is that Trump is not supposed to be president, right? This guy was not supposed to get elected. Both parties agreed on this, and everyone did everything they could to prevent it, and it happened anyway. But climate change is really the main measure of it. And I contrast this to how the American ruling class managed the Cold War. When the Russians got Sputnik into space, what did they do? They didn't say, hey, we need a rocket program. No, they passed the National Security Education Defense Authorization Act, some long kind of national security education bill, and they threw billions of dollars at universities. They basically rebuilt the American university system. In other words, they threw money at not just rocketry, but at poetry and agronomy and drama, the whole thing. And this ruling class, current ruling class, does not seem to exhibit that kind of capacity. So there's a surprisingly limited literature on the ruling class as such. Here's a little sampling from some of the literature that's dealt with this. The first, sort of the oldest thing I found that bemoaned specifically the decline of the American ruling class was an article by E. Digby Blatzel, probably never heard of, I'd never heard of him, in 1964. He was the first to note the decline of the old Eastern elite. This is what Doug Henwood has been said he's going to focus on, is the decline of the Wasp establishment, the old Wasp establishment. And these characters are what Stuart Alsop referred to as the bold Easterners. And Alsop was himself first a member of the OSS and then the CIA and then a journalist. And he really embodied that kind of that ethos and those sets of characters. And they've been increasingly replaced by elites from the South and from the West and from the interior. And Doug Henwood has picked up on this, and also Mike Davis, in his first book, Prisoners of the American Dream, offers a really good explanation as to sort of the rise of this other elements of the American ruling class, what produced this. And a lot of it, the irony of ironies, comes out of the New Deal. It's the result of these massive transfers, these fiscal transfers from the Northeast to the Sun Belt, to the South and the West, which builds out the industries like the military-industrial complex and the infrastructure, the heavily subsidized agriculture, agribusiness. And this is the physical basis for the rise of characters like all of the leaders of what become the new right, Barry Goldwater being the sort of first embodiment of that, coming out of Arizona, right? A civilization that could not have existed without essentially a kind of socialism or a socialized developmentalism driving the development of capitalism. That's what produces Arizona, modern Arizona in many ways. So I see there's geography, and the geography of state spending is important in the story of the ruling class. I'm going to get to why all this matters. One of the better works on this that I've come across is by Mark Misrucci, who's actually in business administration at Ann Arbor, but he seems to be a Marxist of some sort, or at least fluent in Marxism. He's a Dom Hoffian in method, and he tracks his argument is that, his book called The Fragmentation of the Corporate Elite, and his argument is that the ruling class, or as he would call it, the corporate elite, has become increasingly fragmented primarily because of the rise of alternative finance. And with neoliberalism beginning in the around 1980, and the restructuring of American capitalism, the acceleration of deindustrialization, there is a proliferation of sources of finance. This is best embodied in the fact that by the early 90s, GE Capital is the single largest provider of credit for a little while. That changes. GE gets out of that business. So for Misrucci, he argues that what was crucial in creating a coherence during the Cold War was bank boards. That the size of bank boards were really big. They shrink during the 80s. And the centrality of bank boards of directors is again and again shown by this kind of Dom Hoffian power network scholars to be the center of these networks. And so it was upon bank boards that, guys, because they were usually guys from the cement industry would meet guys from aeronautics who would meet people from, philanthropy. And with the rise of alternative finance, banks no longer have this connection to other firms. The size of their boards shrink, and the importance of bank boards as sites of socialization diminishes. Misrucci also notes, as does Henwood, as does Mike Davis, the decline of opposition in the form of the right, the rich, their victory over organized labor and social movements. And I would add, though he does not mention this, the decline of the Soviet Union and actually existing socialism. The disappearance of that threat constitutes a major loss of motivation for elites to circle the wagons and come together and think long term. They feel they have no, nothing to worry about. Schumpeter is interesting in thinking about the decline of the ruling class. In the late 40s, he was writing about worrying that capitalism wouldn't survive. He was worrying that a kind of incremental socialism would take over. And his concern was that if capitalism has no one to take care of it, how will it survive? And what he rooted the decline in elites, what he explained that as was the increasing rationalization of property. So it's kind of a Weberian argument about the joint stock company. And implicit in it is a kind of dematerialization of property. And as this, the joint stock company, the kind of bureaucratized modern firm, for Schumpeter, this was the source of a loss of vitality for elites. They were losing their willingness to defend property, or as he put it, to die on the factory steps defending property if necessary. So there's, the loss of sort of individual propriety means that this class loses some vital connection to their class mission. I would add another element to the irrationality of the American ruling class, and that is the tradition of Southern maximalism and apocalyptic thinking. The Southern ruling class has, from the very beginning of this republic, been marked by a kind of maximalist politics of take it or leave it. This shows up at the Constitutional Convention, where John Rutledge of South Carolina at one point, is one of the only mentions in the transcripts of the Constitution, such as they are. I mean, everybody wrote their different versions, and Madison, it was the main one, and he then bowdlerized it later on. But Rutledge says there's a discussion about limiting the slave trade, and he says, hey, you know what? Morality has nothing to do with it. The only question at stake here is whether or not the Southern states will be part of this project. And if you guys start going after slavery, we're out. Forget it. Patrick Henry Lee of Virginia said something similar that was completely excised from the record until much later, where he opposes a strong federal government. He says, because if you have a strong federal government, pretty soon they'll be coming for your enslaved property, except he used a much harsher word. So the Southern apocalyptic imagination, this elite imagination, is rooted in slavery and the command over labor, the total ownership of human beings, what that does to one's mentality, and also in the monocropping of tobacco, cotton, sugar, and indigo, and the need for vast tracts of land to keep that kind of political economy going. In the South, they practice shifting cultivation, so elites had to have enormous amounts of land because they would just exhaust the land and move on, so they had to have much more land than they could use at any one time. And slavery, plus the unequal concentrations of land, lead to a kind of disbursement of population and an inequality, not just between enslaved African Americans and white elites, but between the white ruling class and everyone else in the South, including the white yeoman class. And due to the lack of purchasing power among the vast majority of people in the South and the low population density, attempts at development, building canals, building railroads, urbanization, all of these things fail again and again. And it's partly because if you build a railroad, well, if there aren't enough people to use it, you're not going to make your money back. And if what people there are all broke and can't afford to use it, then you're definitely not going to make your money back. So the Southern maximalism comes out of this political economy and the relative underdevelopment that it produces, and to this day still marks the U.S. South to some extent. And the clearest example of Southern maximalism is, of course, secession and the Civil War, right? The other source of Southern elite maximalism is that from the time of the Revolution, the completion of the American Revolution on, there's already free territory, right? Vermont begins by outlawing slavery. Massachusetts outlaws slavery, I think, in 1787. And with it, by 1800, there are, a number of states that have outlawed slavery. So Southern elites begin their political life like with their dukes up, like how much further is this going to go? And what I think is interesting about this, and you can find a deeper explanation of this in a Fest Shift from Mike Davis that's coming out called Revolution and Catastrophe or something like that, in which I have an article on the political economy of the South. But the ultimate measure of the kind of apocalyptic, self-destructive nature of this maximalist Southern politics is the Civil War. That class commits suicide. They take their system and they run it over the edge of the cliff, and the whole thing blows up. And we like to sort of excise Southern elites and their tradition at that moment. Say they were defeated and they were destroyed, and then capitalism emerges, et cetera, or conquers the South, or whatever. But of course, the planters and the planter ideal were reincorporated into the American ruling class, and they remain an important element in the American ruling class, and they remain particularly important to the New Right and the geography of the New Right, which is, of course, the South and then the Sun Belt. And you see, I mean, these connections play out in families. The Boswells of the Central Valley of California, the big cotton barons of California. I mean, they are a family that begins growing cotton in Georgia, and it takes them about 3 generations to get to California, and they bring with them the mentality and the traditions. And they're just one example of kind of how the Southern elite diaspora becomes part of the American ruling class in general. Finally, another element in explaining the fragmentation and short-termism and failure to be able to reproduce its own system of the American ruling class is, of course, neoliberal ideology, right? Which is a dangerous utopian idea that markets can rule and that states should step out of the way. And this is maximalist in and of itself, in part because it is born as a reaction, right? Neoliberalism is a defensive ideology. When Hayek and Mises begin this, they are very self-consciously pushing back against what Hayek calls collectivism. So it's really not an ideology of ruling and reproducing a system. It's an ideology of retaking a system that had been lost. And you see all this coming together in the characters of the Koch brothers, right? The Koch brothers. Charles Koch comes out of, not the South, but out of Kansas. His father's a Bircher, John Bircher. And Charles Koch picks up Hayek and Mises in a kind of political school of run by some fanatical purchasers in Colorado. So you add all these explanations up, these layers of explanation up, and you get a ruling class that is increasingly financialized. Its imagination, or the ruling class imaginary. I can't believe I use that word. I don't like that word very much. But the ruling class imaginary is financialized, i.e. dematerialized. There is, if you ever talk to financial elites, it's remarkable how blasé they are about major problems. And I've always gotten the sense it's because they really don't know how anything is done, like from mowing the lawn to making cement. So they have a sense like, if that goes bad, you just move the money from column A to column B. You just exit. You budget it in. The markets have already discounted for that. There's no there in their imagination. There's no places. There's no rising sea levels, masses of people who will launch the next Jacquerie. So it's dematerialized, and it's rooted in extractivist industries, right? We've seen that the two main elements in finance, there's really three, and one I'm not dealing with, which I should, but is tech, and that's very recent. But they share, I think, finance's disdain for the material. 4 minutes, okay. So, in this process, another thing that has helped lead to this loss of coherence in the ruling class through financialization is an increasing dependence on the state. Wolfgang Streeck writes about this, that the indebted neoliberal state is very important for how finance works. Not only has the financial sector grown within core economy capitalism, particularly American capitalism, but as it grows, the dependence of the financiers upon government debt increases. So indebted states are very important. Not rent-seeking states, but rent-extracting states that underwrite the rest of the financial system. Just a little hint of what that means. In 2015, the U.S. spent $223 billion, or 6% of the federal budget, paying the interest on the national debt. That's 1/3 of the military budget as interest payments to elites, to the rent seekers. And this becomes very important, kind of bedrock for the financial system as a whole. Now, why does all this matter? I mean, it matters politically because people obviously do not rebel due to absolute deprivation. If that were the case, then the poorest people would always be in rebellion. But rather, it's relative deprivation. And in everyday life, I think most people experience or are motivated less by the system and more by resentment of elites. And that the left has actually not been very good at kind of illustrating who are these elites. We've made progress since Occupy, right? The arrival of the concept of the 1%, right? The banksters, Wall Street. This is all very important to how political mobilization has happened. That this is not just like a system that's everywhere and diffused that you, as a citizen and a consumer and a worker, are implicated in, but it's these characters, and they go to certain places. They have addresses, they have summer homes, they have Instagram pages, they show off. They're arrogant, and people hate them. And we need to use that and capitalize on it. I also think it's important for us on the left to think about the ruling class because it helps us understand capitalism as a system. Some of the questions that are involved related to this is the question of like the mass versus the rate of surplus value. Marx says this throughout Capital, but never makes too much of it. But that says that the capitalist is concerned primarily with the mass of surplus value, not the rate. Because, of course, whether the rate of return is high or low, you're going to have more money coming to you the larger the magnitude of the capital it is that you throw into circulation. So the concern with the mass rather than the rate means a concern with smashing and grabbing and having now rather than reproducing the system for the long term. And I'm concerned with all of this in part as well because I think it's important that we, with utopian visions, also take very seriously a kind of radical reformist politics. And I'll tell you why. Because capitalism leaves for socialism a technological legacy. And it is not enough in the face of climate change to say that when we overthrow capitalism, and the eco-socialism comes, everything will be dealt with. Because the history of actually existing socialism shows that it's not so easy to totally transform the technological base of the country. I mean, the Soviet Union was heavily dependent on oil. In Bolivia, they're heavily dependent on selling natural gas. And it's not that they don't, have people in the government who are concerned with greening the economy. Venezuela, they have tried to get off oil. It's totally impossible. So part of our task as socialists, it seems to me, is to push for decarbonization now, because if we are so lucky as to have some other social system follow this one, part of our mission now is to leave it some sort of technological legacy that it can build from.